Imagine a social media platform that hosts lively and witty debate about history, where scholars can share expertise, commiserate over think pieces that draw false conclusions from history, celebrate each other's achievements, and collect a veritable trove of dank historical memes. You may know this platform as Twitter, but Twitter historians, particularly medievalists, have carved out a niche that looks very different from the stereotypical internet shoutfest.
Welcome to Augmented Humanity. Our guests are modern explorers working at the intersection of technology and the humanities. They help us to understand ourselves and the worlds we create in this digital age. They are thinkers, creators, makers, and academics working in diverse fields like linguistics, technology, game and object design, and ethics. I'm your host, Craig Goldsmith.
I'm your host, Ellen Dornan.
On this program, we're joined by Dr. Shannon McSheffrey, a medieval historian at Concordia University in Montreal. Professor McSheffrey's research interests center around law, mitigation, gender roles, civic culture, marriage, literacy, heresy, and popular religion in late medieval England. She has published a number of scholarly articles and 5 books. We're also joined by Dr. John Wyatt Greenlee, a medievalist and cartographic historian who recently completed his doctorate at Cornell University, where he wrote his dissertation on Eels in the cultural landscape of medieval and early modern England.
I just wanted to start by saying thank you both so much for joining us today. Medieval Twitter is my favorite thing about the internet, but I know why I got on Twitter because the NEH asked me to. But why did you all get on Twitter? What inspired you to start tweeting about your work and your studies?
First off, thanks for having me here. So I mostly started using Twitter for my work, for sort of talking about academics, because that's where a lot of academic conversations happen, is on social media. And I was interested in sort of connecting with people that I wouldn't meet otherwise. So it's a really great space for that. And then I started using it as a platform to talk about sort of interesting things that I found in my own research. And I found that there was a lot of interest in that. So it just sort of rolled and picked up steam from that point.
I originally joined Twitter because I had teenage daughters who had opened up accounts and I wanted to police their activities. But there was a point where I thought that Twitter would be actually a really useful kind of teaching tool that I would be able to connect with my students, using hashtags that related to my courses or something like that. And I actually fairly soon found out that didn't really work at all because my students mostly don't see Twitter as that kind of a space. They see it as a place where you follow the Kardashians or something like that. But I did begin to realize that there are actually all sorts of other academics that are using this platform. And it's a really great space for sharing, I guess, tidbits that we otherwise don't really get to share in our research. You know, if I'm in the archives and I see something kind of interesting and cool, then, in the past, I mostly just kind of went to myself or maybe to somebody who's sitting at the same table as me in the archive, hey, look at this. But now I can take a picture of it and share it on Twitter and get instantaneous feedback from all over the world. That's one of the things that really sort of got me into it, is that ability to make those connections, like John was just saying, with people that you've never met before. John and I have never actually seen one another, even though we've interacted all sorts of times on Twitter. But this is an opportunity for you to make connections with other scholars that you otherwise wouldn't really come across, I think.
Seems like there would have been a little bit of a chicken and an egg thing there if it's the historians. I mean, you have to sort of at least connect with one other person who's got that interest. So did you each see someone else who was posting these kind of little tidbits or sharing their historian type thoughts? Did you reach out to someone and say, hey, I started putting this stuff up on Twitter, you should check it out?
I can't even remember how it all started. How did you get into it, John? Did you just start following accounts or?
As a graduate student, I had other graduate students who used Twitter to sort of talk a little bit about their research. mostly with each other. And so I think that's how I got into it. And as Shannon was saying, if you run across interesting bits of story in archives or in sources, it's a really nice space to share them. And that sort of builds because your friends see them and retweet them, and their friends see them. And so it expands outward like that. I think the first people that I sort of followed and modeled my Twitter habit after, I guess, were the people immediately around me who I knew personally.
And by these little tidbits, you mean something that isn't necessarily going to be a full-blown essay or research paper, but it's still something that's totally cool and worth sharing.
Yeah, the sort of thing that you would otherwise put in a footnote. It's sort of here's a cool aside. Yeah, I'm not going to expand much more on it, but it's really interesting and I want to share.
To me, since I follow both your accounts, there's an aspect where every one of these tweets offers a window into your larger research. So, Shannon, you may tweet about some sanctuary seeker who, left sanctuary to murder again. And it's very juicy. But if you follow that, then you find this whole body of work on sanctuary seekers. Do you find that it introduces people to your work?
Definitely that is the case. I've been in the game way longer than John has. And so I do think this is an opportunity for historians, for academics to, in a sense, cross over much more than they normally do into other kinds of readers or audiences. I mean, normally we do get, quote, normal people listening to us because we teach them, right? Our students are the normal people that we have in our lives. But beyond that, most of us don't make documentaries. We don't necessarily publish in popular venues like history magazines, and most of us don't do that kind of thing. But this is a way for us to kind of be able to do that in a low stakes way, that we can maybe seduce people. And I just got an email literally 5 minutes ago from somebody who found this material through Twitter and then has bought my book and has found his particular village in England had sanctuary seekers and written something for his parish magazine. So it kind of brings in groups of people who are interested in medieval history but won't necessarily go out and read scholarly articles or books. So it's good at flexing that brain of trying to reach non-specialists.
I think especially it may be a way to explain or demonstrate to the casual audience why history is important to begin with and why the study of history matters, and in a way that maybe is a little more accessible than an academic research paper. Speaking as a normal person.
You both said that when you got on Twitter, you found this academic community there. I mean, what does it look like? Do you have a lot of interaction with colleagues who aren't at your institution or who aren't in your country?
The short answer to that is yes. It's one of the really fantastic things about Twitter and probably other social media platforms as well, but Twitter is the one I primarily use. It lets me talk to people doing medieval history in Indonesia and China and Japan and places in Europe that I wouldn't normally get to see. So colleagues I wouldn't meet otherwise. As Shannon said a minute ago, we've never met, but we've interacted through Twitter. And so I know her work and she knows some of mine. And that happens pretty broadly, actually. As probably with just about any online community, there are really positive people and really negative people. Most of the people I've dealt with have been really very positive. It's a really good interaction with folk, very willing to sort of exchange ideas and sources. One of the great things that I've found is I do most of my work in the United States because I don't have much of a budget and I have a family, so I don't travel a whole lot for research. But I've gotten a lot of material from people who've run across eels, because I work on eels, who've run across eel references in archives, and they will send them to me and say, I found this and I thought of you because I know your work. And so it's been, among other things, a really nice way to expand the reach of my research past which I could do otherwise.
So it's almost like having a broader net where people know that you're looking for this kind of material or would have interest in this kind of material, and so they just send it to you almost unsolicited.
Yeah, that happens not irregularly, which is nice.
What's an example of the negative? Is that someone who trolls the historian Twitter feeds looking to just pick apart every little thing that you post and say why it's unimportant?
So there's a lot of fights in academia generally, and they tend to be often very bitter. And medieval studies is certainly no exception to that. There's a lot of contention and debate around sort of use of terminology. One that keeps going around and has for the last several years is whether or not we use the term Anglo-Saxon to refer to pre-Norman England, and the degree to which that has sort of racist and imperialist and colonialist overtones that, from sort of the foundations of the field in the 19th century. And so that's a really contentious issue that goes back and forth and can get very heated with people on both sides.
And online.
Yes, yeah.
It'll get heated online. They'll be flaming each other. And how could you even possibly use that term? Which is sort of how people behave on social media for
anywhere.
Yeah. It is. And one of the issues with that, especially with, I think, younger scholars, early career scholars, is they don't always know the contours of the argument. And so it's very easy to wander into somebody else's dogfight. And then, depending on which side you wander into, find yourself really kind of caught in the crossfire.
Where you think you've said something almost innocuous, and it turns out you've just not only stepped into a minefield, but started World War IV.
I'm curious, though, whether you see the impact from this sort of political correction on Twitter bleed into your working life at academe. I mean, is it influencing culture, or is it just sound and fury?
Now, I tend to think that it does affect how it is or how aware historians are of particular issues that they might have been a bit blind to before. For instance, I don't have a particular stake in the Anglo-Saxon question because I'm a 15th and 16th century historian, but, I became much more aware of the issue because of its currency on Twitter especially. And so I have changed my teaching stance on this and changed all of my PowerPoint slides, and I've tried to take that vocabulary out. I don't think that the students miss anything by not hearing that word, and so it does actually, I think, bring these issues into the minds of people that might otherwise miss such a debate because it's rather outside their field. So I do think that these things do have real world effects in things like teaching. That is really where we make most of our impact, I think, on the real world.
What is the preferred terminology?
I think most people would now just say early English or just the word English. The idea of the Anglo-Saxon, quote, race, which is often used in tandem with that expression, has become associated, especially with white supremacist ideology. There's no particular reason, as other people have argued, to have a separate term to talk about early English people.
I think the fact that both Shannon and I are pretty well familiar with the contours of this argument at this point answers your question a little bit, because I'm not an early medievalist either. And like Shannon, I don't have a particular bone to pick in this fight. It doesn't really affect my research or my writing that much, but I'm aware of it, and I'm aware of the problematic use of the term, mostly because of the people that I've interacted with Twitter. You asked earlier about connecting with other scholars, and this is one of the ways that ripples out. As a sort of professional historian, I think it's a really nice way of expanding your understanding of the field and where it's going.
And almost in real time. It's not like you're publishing something and then waiting for the email or the letters to come. In this case, someone might say something or present an idea or a statement, and you get almost immediate feedback. I'm looking at some of what we put down in our outline to talk about. I just want to bring this up, this segment, before we run out of time. Drinking with historians and historians at the movies. Is this a drinking game? And how do you do this on Twitter?
I can speak a little bit to the Drinking with Historians because I really enjoy that. Drinking with Historians is essentially a recorded Zoom call with Matt Gabriel and Varsha Venkat, and they'll have a guest on and record it. They'll have a conversation, and they drink, and they talk about the guest's research and whatever history issues are in the news currently and what they're drinking. And so over the course of the hour, they get less and less sober and more willing to say what they're actually thinking about the news or their research. The two of them have a really disparate range of expertise, and the guests they bring on come from a lot of different places. So it's a really nice way to hear a broad scope of historical thought on a nice range of issues. Have you participated with historians at the movies, Shannon?
I have not. My understanding is, you watch this historically themed film and then people are going to tweet about it as they go, But I think that both of these things actually bring up one of the aspects of Twitter that is really enjoyable for a lot of us, which is that it tends to be much less serious a little bit more unbuttoned than our normal kind of scholarly communications. And so it offers the opportunity, for us to be a little bit less starchy, unlocks that aspect of history that, of course, we all know about, but that certainly when we're doing our scholarly books and articles, that most of the time we don't tend to be quite as sardonic.
I think that's a nice place to leave this segment. You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
Thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to start by asking you all how your social media activity is seen within your institutions or among your non-online colleagues. I've seen some people say that they've been advised that having an active Twitter account is a negative, but from what you all are saying, it sounds like it's common practice among some.
I'm a long-standing faculty. I'm tenured. I'm a full professor. And honestly, it doesn't really matter if anybody disagrees with or thinks that it's a bad idea for me to have a Twitter account, where John is in a different situation, so he can talk about that. But, I find that my non-Twitter colleagues, that they mostly just are blissfully unaware of any of this. I mean, for instance, I do have one colleague in my research area. She was very doubtful about the whole idea of Twitter and didn't really want to get involved with it. Thought for some reason that it might be a time sink. Can you imagine that? But she was with me at a conference and people kept coming up to me and talking to me about my Twitter feed. And, these all sorts of graduate students who knew who I was and, knew all about my research and, and were talking about my Sanctuary Seeker of the Day series. And she sort of suddenly a light went on in her head and she realized that this was, in fact, a way that you could make real contacts in an academic sense and that people would come to learn about your research in ways that they do normally through book and journal publications. So I am in absolutely no doubt about its academic value, that the kinds of connections that you can make, the things that you can learn are absolutely invaluable. And I'm definitely a big fan of the idea of graduate students using this as a tool to get people to learn about their research. John interacts with some of my students all the time, and that he is a model for them as a recently finished student in using this as a platform to talk about research.
Do you think there's a power imbalance between, say, tenured faculty and adjuncts, associates, and graduate students as far as what they feel free to say on Twitter?
I think, speaking as a recently graduated graduate student, as recently finished one, a lot of graduate students are cautious about the degree to which they use Twitter. And a lot of them get advice from their advisors and faculty members that they shouldn't use social media platforms at all. Sometimes because it's a time sink, their advisor thinks they should be focusing on their writing or their research. Sometimes because their advisor is concerned that they will put themselves in a position where they'll create a reputation for themselves that will make it hard to get a job. There aren't a lot of jobs anyway. So that has, especially recently, I think, become less of a concern for a lot of graduate students. At present, in the middle of the hiring season, there's a medieval history job available currently in the United States, I think probably Canada too. So to some degree, I think that's taken the shackles off a little bit. And I was initially cautious about using Twitter for those reasons. And the more I sort of used it to talk to people about my work, and the more people got interested in the curiosities of medieval eels, the more I personally came to think that it was a really good place to make connections and to draw people into my work and to make connections between fields. So I work on medieval eels, so that's a bit of sort of ecological history. So my work touches on sort of medieval history and ecology and connects scientists with historians with sort of a broader general public. There aren't a lot of places where you can do that. So I think it's got a lot of value in that there can be power imbalances, but a bit of that is the degree to which you let there be power imbalances. As a graduate student, you don't have to talk to people you don't want to talk to. And one of the nice things about Twitter is it's a sort of constant content creation, right? And so it's a river of content, and you may tick somebody off, but if that happens 2 years ago and you're looking for a job next year, the amount of tweets between then and now, it's like standing under a waterfall. The volume of content sort of washes away most sort of single issue problems.
I would think some of it is a personality issue and an approach issue. I mean, if you're the kind of person who wants to say, write, or post inflammatory, contentious things, you may have a problem in every arena of your work life. But I thought it was interesting what you were saying about the graduate students' advisors, because I certainly think in the current context that there is a little bit of a fear that every little thing you might do or say online that gets archived is going to come up in a job interview or whatever. So it's actually kind of refreshing to hear that there's some encouragement to just get out there and go for it. I was actually also thinking how if there's no jobs, then maybe this is actually the thing they need to do and get sponsors.
What about the opposite, though? I mean, would you, John, as a job seeker, list your followers and your viral tweets on your CV? Is there a line item there that's under scholarly communications and publications?
Yeah, actually. So my CV lists my Twitter handle up at the top with the contact information. I list the Twitter feed as sort of a public outreach section of my CV. I don't list individual tweets. But yeah, it's certainly a presence there. And for me, at least, it's created other opportunities. This podcast will go on my CV, as well as a couple of others that I've done. And I've had opportunities to write a couple of pieces coming out of my Twitter account that go on my CV. And so it's not just that the Twitter itself is on the CV, but sort of the pieces that follow from it are as well.
I also think what Ellen is asking is that if you had 100,000 followers on Twitter, is that something that might carry weight? If I went in on my resume and said, well, I've got 100,000 people reading this stuff every time I post about eels.
That's an interesting question. And I'd be curious to hear Shannon's take on this too, because we're coming at, I'm sure, academic job searches from really different perspectives at this point. So most of the faculty that I dealt with at Cornell were a lot like the people that Shannon described just a little bit ago. We're sort of blissfully unaware of Twitter. So my advisor and my committee knew that I had a sort of active Twitter account, but mostly they just sort of were bemused by it until it started getting traction that created other things, right? That created other opportunities that they saw as being maybe more valued, right? So papers and articles and things. So I don't know off the top of my head that if I sent materials to a job search, for an academic job search, that highlighted the 7,000 Twitter followers or whatever it is, and I talked to these people on a regular basis about history, I don't know how much weight that would carry, especially set aside next to like, okay, well, have you published peer-reviewed articles, or do you have a book contract or things like that? That's my sense, is that it wouldn't carry a ton of weight, but I'd be curious to hear Shannon's thoughts on that.
Well, I think that John is probably pretty realistic about it. I think that I would be inclined, and some of my other colleagues who are Twitter-oriented would be inclined to see this as a very positive thing that would be a big check mark in the yes column. But however, that there would be some who would have the opposite kind of reaction. You know, it just reminds me of way back in the day where some of my professors didn't like papers that were written on computers because that really was not appropriate, and playing an Atari game and writing your paper instead of doing something good like writing it on your typewriter. So there is a resistance to new technologies and new ways of communicating. This is definitely, obviously, not a new thought to think that these kinds of social media platforms have revolutionized the way that people can talk to one another. And if you're not on it, you don't understand it. I'm married to a history professor who is very resistant to social media. He does read my Twitter feed on a regular basis. And because I made him at one point, I threatened divorce, you've got to read this. And also I send him tweets that I think he will be interested in. But if you don't even have that kind of access, if nobody in your personal life, your close family is doing this stuff, then you just literally it doesn't exist for you. You don't know it's there. And so it's at best going to be just a irrelevance.
If I could follow up on that, I think one of the tricky things in terms of talking to academics is academics especially historians, we sort of long form, written out, lots of detail, lots of footnotes, as much information as you can get in there, prove it to me. And that's not how you tell stories on Twitter. It's not a medium that is even capable of that kind of communication. One of the things I love about Twitter is that it forces me to really think through how I'm telling the stories I want to tell, but they're never fully fleshed out in a way that a historian would demand of a peer-reviewed paper or a book, right? And so one of the tricks, at least, is to be able to demonstrate through a really stripped-down storytelling mechanism that you've got a lot of verified and real historical research and data and thought and methodology behind what you're doing. I think it's really easy to not do that. And then when you're trying to talk to academics, to historians about the thing that you're tweeting about, if they can't look at it and see how it connects to something that they're more familiar with as sort of thinking about as research and work product, then it's hard for them to see the value in it at all.
I guess that leads me to my question about sort of your broader online presence. Both of you have websites. Shannon, you have sanctuaryseekers.ca, and John, you have historiacartarum.org, that are sort of big projects that have a lot of different tools, and it does have those sort of rich citations and sources that you're talking about, the demonstration of all the research, but there's also sort of a lot of visualization and connection and using some of these other sort of new media tools to represent your work or make new connections. How do your Twitter feeds fit in with the rest of your digital presence?
I actually have had some databases online since 2008. But the Sanctuary Seekers website that I've recently launched is actually an outgrowth of my Twitter feed rather than something that pre-existed the Twitter feed. So in a sense, what happened was that I had a whole bunch of research that I had done for a book that I published in 2017. One day it just sort of came to me that I was looking at people who sought sanctuary. So each of them had their own little story, right? The little vignette. There was one day where I thought to myself, what I should do is have a Twitter series that each day I would tweet about one of them and their story. And that was something I thought that I could just do very quickly. And it just took over my life for about 15 months. It took me to go through the most interesting cases, which is 300 of them that ended up, on this Twitter feed. Even as I was doing it, I was sometimes doing more research for each of those people. So in other words, I had actually more research than what I had had for my book. And so I decided that I would do this website as a kind of capturing, because as John mentioned earlier, one of the things about Twitter is indeed that it is ephemeral. It sits there, but it's very hard to find tweets that are old. I mean, you can go through somebody's Twitter feed if you're looking for dirt on them, if they're a politician or something like that. But nobody is very likely to go through my Twitter feed looking for all of this research on sanctuary seekers. So this was a way to kind of collect it in a fashion that would be, for instance, usable in classrooms and stuff like that. So actually, there is all sorts of intertwining and feedback between these different kinds of internet platforms. I don't know about what John's experience with this has been.
Yeah, so my experience is slightly different. The website that I manage and sort of have been growing for the last 5 or 6 years, I think it predates my sort of consistent use of Twitter by a good bit. So my dissertation was on eels in English history, and I've turned myself into an eel historian. But I'm trained as a cartographic historian, as somebody who's interested in maps and the way that people sort of represent their spaces in the world and think about how the world's constructed. And so I had started a website to host a growing portfolio of digital humanities projects that dealt with questions of mapping in space and spatial representation. And then the eels sort of fell into that as part of my dissertation that talks about eel rent, when people are paying eels as currency to their landlords. And I had wanted to map those and to see where they all fell. And so there's a section of that website that deals with an interactive map of eel rents. But the website more broadly is aimed at mapping history. And so mostly I tweet about eels. And so the Twitter is one part of my research portfolio, I guess. And then the website sort of captures a different side of the work that I do.
Although the eel rent map is fantastic. I mean, it's really interesting to see the disparity among the centuries as time goes on. And, you can sort of imagine the environmental conditions contributing to particularly rich eel harvests.
Stuff of nightmares, as far as I'm concerned. We'll get into that in the next segment, my nightmares. You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
Thank you both so much for talking with us today. I just want to start with the point that the whole idea of medieval Twitter is a little bit weird. How do you see using a really modern social media platform for communicating the relevance of your field? Because you're drawing in all these people who maybe are not medievalists, but who are finding connections between the times that you research and now.
Well, I think one of the things that always surprises people, and this goes way back into the dawn of computing, is that medievalists have always been engaged in new technologies. We have to be trained to understand arcane and kind of technically difficult things because we have to read Latin and we have to be able to decode these weird manuscripts and stuff like that. And so things like computer coding and other sorts of things related to new technology has just been a kind of natural for medievalists, which always surprises people because, we're supposed to be writing everything on parchment with our quills or something like that. And obviously Twitter is not a technically difficult thing, but it is part of that package. I think that medieval historians are at least as and often more engaged in new technology than other fields, I think. There's always been that kind of a match, I think. And John, do you have other insights on this?
I know a lot of medievalists who lean very heavily on new technology. One of the great things in the last 10 years is the digitization of medieval manuscripts, which makes it possible to see really big parts of archives from the United States or from Canada. The archives are in France or Italy or England that you wouldn't get to see otherwise because of time and expense. And so the ability to sort of pull up leaf after leaf after leaf of medieval manuscript and read through the sources you need without having to spend the time to travel to Europe has been really beneficial to me and lots of people that I know that I work with. I think it does surprise people sometimes the degree to which medievalists lean on recent technology, but we do. I really hope that most of the people I'm talking to aren't medievalists on Twitter. The goal, for me at least, is to be able to take the work that I do and connect other people to it and help them see why they should be interested in it and why it might matter to them.
Certainly for myself, as a layperson, I was unaware until the prep for this program about eels as currency and some of the subject material that you get into. And I'll be honest, I'm not joking when I say, for me personally, eels are the stuff of frickin' nightmares. Have you seen any sort of change in perception or light bulbs go off for people as you've gotten into this subject material online?
Absolutely. And that's sort of been one of the most rewarding things about it. I think a lot of people have your initial reaction to eels. We don't eat much eel in the United States at this point. They're not really part of our diet, and they're not really a part of our culture. And so they're really sort of distanced from us in a lot of ways. And most people tend to look at eels as sort of weird and creepy and snake-like, but slimy. Like, snakes aren't actually slimy, but eels really are. And so they're a bit repulsive to a lot of people. And this is problematic for a bunch of reasons that are not historical, but current. Eels are critically endangered. Their numbers have dropped like 90% in the last 50 years. And they're one of the most heavily trafficked animals on Earth. So really popular for eating in China and Japan. But it's really hard to get people interested in saving them because they're slimy and gross and weird, and why should we care? And so one of the things that I have really come to appreciate about Twitter as a tool is that I can take the work that I do with medieval eels, which is really super niche. It shouldn't necessarily interest people on its face, but I can make it interesting and funny through memes and jokes and short form storytelling. And I can get people interested in it in a way that just telling them, population's dropped off 90% in the last 50 years doesn't do. Statistics don't usually convince people. Stories do. And so sort of being able to get people thinking about eels as something other than the sort of slimy, gross snake-like thing, and sort of thinking about them as being a part of our past for a really long time and some really important and funny ways. I think it gets people thinking about him as an animal that's worth saving. Twitter is a place where I can take a rather niche medieval subject and make it really relevant in modern conservation conversations.
And what about you, Shannon? Have you had any kind of similar experiences like that, where something that might have been more obscure or niche to the layperson, you've been able to sort of put out there in a way that's more engaging and accessible for the modern lay audience?
Well, I think my tweets are about sanctuary, which is obviously a less, in some senses, quirky subject than eels. It's already an important issue, especially in the United States, obviously with the sanctuary movement in the US that really has exploded since I started work. I didn't go into the subject for that reason. It's really post-dated my entry into working on sanctuary. I do to some extent connect, as other sanctuary historians do, the medieval idea of sanctuary, which is an ancestor of the modern sanctuary movement, but is not exactly the same. As a historian, I am working on medieval sanctuary, not on its modern versions. But just last week, there was a news story that sounded actually very similar to some of the kinds of anecdotes that I've got coming out of the 15th century, where some people had taken asylum in a church somewhere in the middle of the United States, and it had been surrounded by law enforcement officers. It's exactly the same kind of story that I sometimes have of a medieval criminal, which is different from the kinds of sanctuary seekers we have today. You're normally refugees or somebody who's innocent and trying to escape some sort of prosecution or persecution. My guys are normally actually criminals who are seeking to avoid actually execution. There are lots of resonances that you can kind of point out using Twitter, that kind of pithy communication that Twitter specializes in, I guess.
You're saying something really critical there, which is, to me, as a layperson, which is connecting all these dots through human history, especially in the short-term memory of the 21st century. I think a lot of people feel like, well, this is happening now and it never happened before and it's not connected to anything else. But really, these stories have been happening over and over again in different flavors. And you're connecting those dots in a way that I think is digestible to the layperson.
Can I ask about one thing that I see a lot on medieval Twitter and historical Twitter is during the coronavirus, every couple of weeks, somebody comes along and writes a think piece about the plague in the Dark Ages, and all the medievalists go, oh my God, stop it, right? What's going on there?
One of the themes of those sorts of think pieces that were coming out, it's the silver lining plot line that we all want. We're having a hard time right now because of the pandemic. And if we look back at this, time that everybody in their imaginations knows was a terrible time in human history, the Dark Ages, aka the Middle Ages, where there was just lots of darkness everywhere and sun didn't shine. And, and during that time, there was backwardness and superstition. And I will just add for a little bit of a context here that the Black Death in Europe wiped out about half of the population. The tolls are far more significant than what we're seeing so far from the coronavirus, but the plot line is that the Renaissance happens after this, and it's caused by the Black Death. So you have this terrible thing happening, but then there's light, right? And the problem with that plot is that historians don't hold with the kind of idea that there is darkness before and light afterwards, that we don't have that same sort of stereotype of what the Middle Ages was. We actually do think the sun did shine sometimes, and that there was no more backwardness than there has been in other periods of history, et cetera, et cetera. And so the Middle Ages gets used constantly in popular culture as a kind of thought space that on the one hand is filled with romanticism and castles and princesses and things like that. And on the other hand is, a kind of flip side of modernity. So it's a way that we can think about progress and how it is that as moderns we have overcome those bad things of the past. So the Middle Ages has something of a dual aspect in popular culture, but those stereotypes are not helping us understand a much more complicated period of human history. And the lessons that we might learn through those sorts of think pieces about how something good might come out of this pandemic are not really anchored in actual historical example. So that's why it is that medieval historians tend to have hairy fits about it. Probably my most popular tweet actually was me reacting and using the F word. I don't use this very often, but I did find with this experience that it augmented the circulation and number of likes. And as soon as you do that, then holy cow, it just I don't know why, but you get a whole bunch more likes for it when you do that.
When people say, for example, this is the modern plague, that is to you a misnomer?
Well, I think that it's just different, and I'm not saying that there isn't anything that we might learn about studying past pandemics. I mean, clearly there is, but it needs to be more than uninformed, flat stereotype for us to actually learn anything from it. And I'm not even saying that there wouldn't be something good coming out of the pandemic. There are things that we have learned to do. We've learned to interact online, actually, much more effectively. Academics have started doing these fantastic online conferences that, yes, you don't get to meet people in person, but on the other hand, I get to go to all sorts of talks and conferences that I would never be able to because I'm in Montreal and I can't flit over to England or Belgium or wherever just to go to a seminar. And so there are these good things that have, in a sense, come out of this particular moment where we've been forced into doing different things. But that's not the same thing as reinscribing a myth of modern superiority that is really part of that idea of flipping from the Dark Ages to the Renaissance that medievalists object to.
That causality, that chain of there was the plague and then they overthrew their feudal lords and then there was the Renaissance and everybody was happy forever, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And there was great rejoicing.
Yes, yeah. And everybody stopped killing one another. And as we know, the 20th century and the 21st century have been models of lack of violence.
So do you engage in this way with your Twitter feed to sort of try to reframe some of these mythical narratives for the lay people in particular that are reading you online?
I personally mostly retweet things on this. This is not my bailiwick, but what I can do is, in a sense, broadcast what it is that other people who are the experts in these things, urge people to follow the particular historians who deal with these things with expertise.
Right. More like curating.
Yeah.
In a way.
Mm-hmm.
I take sort of the same approach for sort of the same reasons that Shannon does. It's not sort of my area of expertise generally. I would say, though, that both the kind of work that Shannon does on Twitter and that I do sort of deal with this issue of managing the stereotypes of the medieval, right? Medieval is sort of a byword for dark and dirty and backwards and all sorts of things. And one of the things that both of us do is spend a lot of time sort of fleshing out what the medieval period actually looked like and making it much more real to people. When it's not flat, when it's not just a period of darkness before we get to the Renaissance. The medieval period is sort of a bit of Renaissance salesmanship as much as anything else, right? It's people in Renaissance Italy trying to make themselves feel good about where they are by looking back not to the people immediately preceding them, but to the Romans. But what Shannon and I both do is make that past much more sort of lively and accessible. And once you can draw people into the story like that, then they're not dealing with stereotypes anymore. They're dealing with facts and dealing with interpretations of facts in a much more sort of holistic way, which is really helpful.
The interpretation of these things called facts. What a concept. You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
It's such a pleasure for me to be here today with two of the people who are making my favorite part of the internet. I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about how you do it. Both of you employ humor. I've seen you employ juicy clickbait headlines, that sort of great internet lead-in of, oh, and then he murdered again. So what do you all find is really important for getting people's attention or for getting people engaged when you're telling these little tiny, beautiful stories on Twitter?
I think there's a couple things, for me at least. You have to start with something that's at least interesting one way or another to you. If it's not interesting to me, then I have a really hard time making it interesting to other people. And then I rely, as you said, very heavily on humor. And so trying to think of a way to frame the bit of research that I've got in front of me in a way that will make people either notice or laugh or sometimes be surprised. And I work with medieval eel rents, and we're talking about numbers of eels in like hundreds of thousands. And so that gets surprising sometimes to people. So yeah, sort of thinking about ways to take the very small research nugget I've got and make it interesting. And readability, I try to make tweets very readable by breaking them into short sentences that are separated by spaces, so line breaks, so they're much easier to read than like a block paragraph.
John has hit a number of really crucial things. I've been working at academic writing now for 3 decades, and I always find that I'm continuing to learn to write, but doing a lot of Twitter has really helped me refine how to be pithy. Pithiness is absolutely the heart of Twitter, and I, like many academic writers, have a tendency to be wordy. You know, you have to fit into the 280 characters in one tweet. That's one of the things I actually quite like about it, is that like really thinking better in more clear terms about reaching your audience and thinking hard about how it is to convey things in an effective way.
Whether it's retweets or whether it's the fresh, pithy take on the subject material at hand, do you compose these carefully before you post them, or do you ever just whip out the phone and sort of just type as you go the way some people do into Twitter? Are these carefully articulated, edited before you put them out there, even if it's only 280 characters or less?
Depends on what I'm tweeting, I guess. For most of the day when I'm tweeting things, it's much more sort of ad hoc. But each weekday I tweet an eel history tweet, sort of a more formal one. And that takes time and consideration and sort of planning and writing. And as Shannon was saying earlier, it's hard writing. I very often will write the tweet and then realize I'm, 400 words over. And how do you shrink that back down in a way that doesn't just fit what you want to get on the page, but makes it, as Shannon said, pithy and interesting. And so those take sort of more planning and thought, and then usually I'll attach a meme or an image to them, and finding the image I want to use, writing the meme if that's what I'm using, also takes time. So for those, the sort of one a day, here's your eel history tweet of the day kind of tweet, those are much more composed and careful.
Yes, and same with me. And I just borrow other people's memes. I don't create them in the way that John does. But searching for images, that was one of the things as I went back and looked at my early Sanctuary Seeker of the Day. I didn't necessarily use images that often. And it soon became clear to me that the image is a really important part of a tweet. When I see a medieval image, I know, that's not something about the President of the United States. It's about the Middle Ages. So my feed, like I imagine almost everybody's, is mixed mixed up with all sorts of stuff, right? Trying to find the right images was something that actually did take quite a long time to be able to find good images and figure out, how I was going to go about it. At one point, I began to realize that the paintings, especially of Peter Bruegel, were gold mines for me, being able to find, late medieval, early modernish people doing things, because he's got so many different people doing things in his paintings, and I could just take little snippets of them. That became one of my methods.
I have a question just because you brought up how mixed up all our Twitter feeds are. I know that there is bleed between the medieval and the current political situation. And John, I just want to bring up why your Twitter feed blew up the other day. And for those who are listening, this program was recorded right after the New York Times published the first article about the president's taxes. And you translated his $750 that he paid in taxes into what the equivalent would have been in medieval eel rents. Some paltry, 1,100 eels or something like that, right?
I don't remember the exact number, but yeah.
People sort of piled on and looked at how many eels would it cost for the president to have covered his hairdressing bills, for example, or how many eels does he owe? And I don't know whether that was one of your carefully composed tweets or whether you just had your eel rent calculator and you were like, yeah.
It's one of the weird things about Twitter, I guess, is that the things you don't necessarily expect to blow up do, and vice versa sometimes. That was something I dashed off right before dinner. Several years ago, out of curiosity, and because it's interesting, I had done what does a medieval eel get you in today's currency kind of calculation. It's on my website. It's a fun little resource. It's very back of the napkin. I wouldn't put it in an academic paper or anything, but it's useful for things like that. You say, well, like his $70,000 that he's spending on his hair is like 115,000 eels. Like, that's a lot of eels.
What size eels? I mean, you're talking like fist length, arm length?
Probably about arm length is fair. Most of the eel rents are due in silver eels, so the full-size adult ones, those are migrating back down to the sea. So arm length, 6 to 12 pounds.
Okay, I've got a picture.
It gives you grist for your next nightmare.
Yes, exactly.
You had asked about the people sort of latching onto that, and those are places where you can give people a different framework. And it's funny, right? You think it's like 1,100 eels is what he pays in taxes every year. That's a very standard peasant rent for medieval England. It's like 1,000 or 1,500 eels. And so even medieval peasants are paying more in eels than this guy's paying. So it's a nice reframing, and it caught. So you never really know what's going to catch.
Yeah. You were talking about this, Shannon, and then Ellen talked about things being mixed up. I'm definitely curious, do you all separate your personal tweets from your professional tweets? A lot of these tweets are you speaking as historians, as credentialed members of academic institutions. Do you also just, in the same Twitter feed, do you tweet about pie you made yesterday, or do you have separate personal accounts for those sorts of things?
I tend to use Facebook for the pies, and Twitter I don't do very much personal stuff, really. I made a choice that my Twitter was mostly going to be about research things. I follow all kinds of things that are about other stuff. Once I realized that my students were mostly not following me, like that they didn't think that Twitter was about academic things and they didn't want academic things fouling up their timeline, right? Then I decided that, I could, for instance, retweet things that relate to politics and stuff like that I might have been a little bit more reluctant to do otherwise. Every once in a while, I probably tweet something that is political or says that, my provincial government in Quebec is doing something silly related to pandemic or something like that. But mostly I do the scholarly stuff. What about you, John?
Mine's just a big hodgepodge. So sometime in the morning, I'll do a eel tweet of the day. But the rest of the day, it's really kind of mixed. My kids are really funny, I think. So I tweet a lot of things that my kids say and, other random things going on. But I think Shannon touched on something important. It comes down to choices, right? So the choice that I made was I really only had time in my life for one social media platform. And so Twitter was it. And I think when I started using Twitter consistently, I was much more hesitant about sort of mixing up personal and professional. But at this point, I don't really care. I'm very careful with what I share about my kids and my family, but I'm not too concerned about the sort of bleed between the two because I'm sort of thinking of it in terms of a reflection of who I am. I'm a historian and that and a whole bunch of other things. And so people get to see that. I think it's useful that I don't just appear as an academic because I want to talk to people who are not academics, and it's useful if they can see that I'm having, a fight with my kid's school board over something.
Lots of people are very personal on Twitter, and I have no problem with that. I don't think it's unacademic or anything like that. I'm not especially like that because that is actually a reflection of who I am, that I'm not a sharer, let's just say. So I think that Twitter is so many different things. I mean, my children who are in their early 20s have completely different things mostly showing up on their Twitter feeds than what is on mine, except there are obviously the crossovers where we're all seeing things about the pandemic, and we're all seeing stuff, even in Canada, tremendous amounts of stuff about American politics. And we get Canadian politics too.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. Well, I guess I could probably try to block phrases and stuff like that, but it would be extremely hard, I think, to take that off.
This might be sort of a final question for this last segment. The stuff that you're putting on your Twitter feeds, especially as it relates to your work as historians, may not be the stuff upon which resumes are built, but are there mechanisms for saving and archiving these tweets? Like, I'm thinking in particularly the sanctuary seekers. I mean, that's almost like a real project. It just happened to take place on Twitter. So is there a mechanism for you to capture those tweets? Should you ever, say, want to republish them or recontextualize them? Or did you save the images and texts that you put up, or do screen grabs or anything like that? Or would you just have to go scroll through your own river?
When I was doing the Sanctuary Seekers series, I realized that I was looking through manuscripts and stuff like that to come up with the material that I was doing. So it was a real research, and that it was going to, in effect, be kind of lost in the river. So I did create a website, sanctuaryseekers.ca, that effectively captures and updates. I mean, one of the things was some of those posts then engendered discussion from people who had found other things that were relevant or something like that. And so, I can update, in a sense, that discussion. And in order to create that, it was necessary to go through the Twitter feed to bring that stuff into a form in this website. I'm hoping that John's material is effectively woven into his thesis and will be part of the book that he will publish. I was doing it after I had written the book, and I'm doing a little bit of tweeting on the book that I'm writing now, but it doesn't seem as suited, in a sense, for the Twitter format. But John's stuff, I'm hoping, is going to make its more indelible form, I guess, in the scholarly publications.
I hope so, too. Most of the material that I tweet is from the research I've done for my dissertation, a database of 1,500 or so separate pieces of eel history. Most of the time, I'm kind of picking from them and trying to tell an interesting story from one of them. I didn't start out trying to manage my tweets, because it started with me doing just sort of one-offs, like, oh, here's this funny thing I found in the archives, and share it. And then it sort of worked up to the point when I'm doing it once a day. So at this point, I built a database to sort of keep track of which of these little bits of facts I had been sharing. And the meme I used, make sure I'm not retelling the same story like a month later, which is sometimes really hard to remember. Was it a month ago or 6 months ago or 8 months ago? If it was 6 or 8 months ago, then maybe I want to retell it because there are people who don't remember it or didn't see it, or I've added new followers. At this point, I've got a database to help me keep track of those tweets, and I'm sure that there are probably sort of third-party apps that will do that for you, but I just built my own.
Because, at a certain point, it becomes a project in and of itself.
But there's no magic wand to just pull your whole feed.
Especially if you're doing 365 eel tweets a year.
I don't do weekends. So,
okay. But still, it builds up rapidly. And there's no way you can remember exactly what you might have said or not said. Well, this has just been a really, really fascinating discussion.
Thank you both so much. You just broadened our horizons tremendously. And I just want to say, for anybody who's squeamish around eels, the pictures of the cute baby elvers, they will warm the cockles of your eel-fearing heart, and you will change your attitudes.
Well, thank you. This has been really enjoyable.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us.
And if you would like more information and to follow these Twitter feeds, you can go to twitter.com and follow at Medieval McSheff. That's spelled McSheff, at Medieval McSheff. and follow at GreenleeJW. We also have more links up at our webpage. Augmented Humanity is a program of the New Mexico Humanities Council, produced in partnership with KUNM-FM. You can visit us online and find out more about our programs at nmhumanities.org. Our theme music comes courtesy James Whiten, and we've had production assistance from Tristan Klum.